I am Katie Walker, and I am here to talk about ketamine and athletes and how the brains of athletes are different than some of the people who have not been through athletic training. So as athletes, we're trained to really push through, right? We have short-term goals. We have for a long-term season per se, which is still sometimes short-term, but we push through injuries. We push through raining, through sun, through getting up early, through staying out late, to every different aspect of sacrifice athletes are trained to do. So therefore, I always like to say with athletes, we go big or we go home, right? Because we have a goal. And it doesn't matter if we're dragging our leg or dragging our arm or we've had traumatic brain injury. None of that matters. What matters is the goal to win the season. And athletes have been able to push through so many different pieces, right? So physically, we see those pieces, but really it's the mental health aspects that we don't always see sometimes as athletes, to where we don't understand necessarily how our brain's working in comparison to maybe the traditional mindset who's not been trained on how to win a season or how to push through injuries. So therefore, sometimes with athletes, it may be we seem fine, and then the next thing you know, we kill ourselves because we just don't have effective coping mechanisms on how to truly address what is going on, or even how to identify it. So as athletes, I'm not an athlete now, I guess, but I did play Division I sports in college, and I've been around the mental health space, a little bit. So I'm able to see kind of the difference as to how the mental health space doesn't always look at the level of training that someone comes from. So if you picture an athlete, athletes always have to perform. And if they don't perform their best, they're going to lose. And sometimes that can destroy their career. That can destroy their mental health, the physical health, the health of the team. There's so much that relies on an athlete performing optimally for the entire season, right? So you can't have an off day when you're an athlete. Everybody does, but we don't want to, because that means that, we're not keeping up with the pace that we feel like we should keep up with. So what we're seeing a lot of times is athletes are extreme high performers and they can push through. But sometimes when we start having some situations that come up that make us have self-doubt on our skill set, right? So it could be a slump. Everybody goes through a slump, and is it a slump? Is it us having that internal thought process to where we are our own worst enemy, to where we're overcorrecting, to where we get the nips and we choke, or we go into, the last quarter, last period, last inning, whatever else, and, we lose the game, right? Or we win the game. But either way, it's one of those aspects to where it's one of the highest pressure situations. And are we going to perform? And a lot of times we do. And sometimes we try and we still don't make it, right? So sometimes we can feel kind of that heaviness start to weigh in on us. But as athletes, you can't tell necessarily, because we are such high performers, we can push through. So a lot of times you'll see athletes, they may start dealing with anxieties to where they, don't know if they can get on the field, on the court, in the rink. They feel a lot of pressure, and they just don't know if they can do it, but they can step up and they can push through it. But sometimes those symptoms over time will actually duplicate to where you can tell that an athlete's performance starts decreasing somewhat. And it could be an injury. We don't really look at our own mental health, right? As an athlete, because we're just pushing through. So the neat thing with ketamine infusions in athletes is it speaks to the brain on the level the athlete is used to speaking on, right? Which is kind of themselves. So ketamine infusions allows the brain to go into a meditative type space to where it gets disconnected from all that heaviness that's around you. So whether that is symptoms of anxiety or depression, or you've had a traumatic brain injury to where you just don't feel like you're thinking right all the time, or, you're constantly processing stuff when you're sleeping, or you feel like you're fighting when you're sleeping, or you wake up this kind of piece, so many different things that go on in the brain. And a lot of times we just can't identify them because our brain's way smarter than what we are consciously, to where if we're trying to have that self-introspection of our brain, we get lost, or we start antagonizing our brain. So we're not necessarily walking with our brain. Instead, it's almost like we're fighting with our brain because we think we know what's going on, and sometimes we don't always know. So if we think we know what's going on and we can actually get to the root cause of it and we feel some type of resolution, then we've truly integrated what we were struggling with. But if we think we know what's going on and we keep hammering it, hitting it, and trying, it feels like it keeps getting worse, then we've actually not addressed what's really troubling us. So the neat thing with ketamine infusions is actually bringing the most scientific neurologic aspect into mental health that coexists with psychedelic research. And ketamine infusions are available now, right? Real time. You can get a ketamine infusion. And that's the beauty of it, right? Because psychedelics, they're still coming around. And it's going to take a second with those. But the neat thing is, as we have real-time access to ketamine, let's go ahead and educate ourselves on this to see how we can actually integrate and work with our mind instead of feeling like we're mentally ill and suppress it. So unfortunately, in the mental health world right now, we feel like our brain gets off track. We want to give medications to more so suppress or stimulate, right? Uppers, downers. And really the neat thing about ketamine is ketamine causes emotional regulation. So if your brain's too hot, it causes it to go in the green zone. If it's too cold, it causes it to go in the green zone. But the fact of the matter is we have to be able to identify some of those aspects that's causing our mood to cycle, which is causing our game to get worse or causing negative aspects with our families. There's a lot of stuff there, especially professional athletes who are on the road a lot. I mean, you guys are missing out on so much stuff, right? So there's all these different aspects that we have to really consider. And if we can identify those pieces, truly identify them, then that's when we find peace. And that's the goal. The goal is that we can live in the present. Living in the present is complete neutrality. That's peace. If we are in the present, what happens a lot of times is we take past experiences and we will put those on our present, which is a triggering moment that can happen. Or we take those past experiences and we put them on the future to prepare for the future. So it's taking a bad play that we messed up, recognizing that, and then preparing for the future. But when in reality, the current play that we're doing right now is really what we should be focused on. So it takes pieces and it just kind of confuses things. So what ketamine infusions do, because there's a lot of words out there that are honestly kind of scary, I think, with ketamine infusions. But what ketamine infusions do is it's typically an IV or IM. There are oral aspects out there as well, which I would be very aware of the oral piece. I do believe that the oral piece is helpful. I think it increases access, but I also think that as a society, we don't know how to regulate anything. So to be in a controlled environment at your home, an enriched environment, working with oral ketamine therapies with a coach or a therapist or a physician who's really helping you to monitor different pieces, I think that's the best angle to go to with the oral ketamine therapies. But what ketamine does is ketamine actually crosses the blood-brain barrier. So it's a layer outside of our brain, crosses the blood-brain barrier. It blocks these certain receptors in our brain called your NMDA receptors, not to be confused with MDMA, but your NMDA receptors, which are your glutamate receptors. And it partially blocks them. And when it partially blocks them, it tells the receptors it's got a low amount of glutamate, and glutamate gets produced. So glutamate's a beautiful thing in our brain. It actually causes neurogenesis. So glutamate stimulates something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factors, and that's neurogenesis. That's new growth in the brain. So if you've had a traumatic brain injury as an athlete and you've had damage to those pathways, and you've also had trauma, right? So you've had physical trauma, but then there's also mental trauma, right? You may not recognize it, but mental trauma from getting hit, it just catches your brain off guard. So your brain's like, what just happened? That's trauma to your brain. So even if you think you processed it or you didn't process it, you got hit and your brain didn't know what happened. So your subconscious got hit, right? So that makes it more elevated. But with the neurogenesis aspect, you get the neurogenesis from the ketamine piece, and it allows your brain to continue to duplicate what it knows. So behaviorally, our brain duplicates what it knows, same as physical, right? So with the physical piece, you have muscle memory. We all have muscle memory. Your muscles actually don't have memory. They're just fibers that contract and relax. But what happens is you have behavioral memory as well. So the muscle memory is the physical aspects of the brain remembers, but also the behavioral memory. So, but more so the behavioral memory doesn't necessarily come from your conscious remembering. It's more so from your subconscious remembering. So you got your conscious, you got your subconscious. They're both here, right? Conscious is, sorry, I switched them up on you. Conscious is very weak, analytical, and also likes checkpoints. Subconscious is stupid, simple, strong. It's what saves us. It's what allows us to survive, right? So subconsciously, when you're predicting things as an athlete, you've got a really good subconscious, right? Because you can predict different things going on. You can read people's emotions. You can see their eyes, right? So you're doing all this stuff, right? So it's your subconscious and your conscious that are kind of balancing on both of those aspects. But really, when you react in sports, it's your subconscious that's more so reacting, not your analytical conscious mindset, because it needs a little bit of time to look at that. So you've got a really good mix of both of these pieces. But what happens with ketamine infusions and what happens in life in general is when you're struggling, if we're using that consciousness to have some self-reflection on what's going on with us, we're going to try our best to guess what's going on. And sometimes we're wrong, period. And that's why we can't drop it sometimes, because it's maybe a piece that we just can't hear to where we can successfully integrate that. But what happens with ketamine infusions is your conscious goes down and your subconscious comes up. So they're on a level playing field. So your conscious can look at your subconscious and it can analyze it. And when it analyzes it, it's your objective brain looking at your emotional brain, which is amazing. Because here's the thing about emotions and objects. Your objectiveness is your physical piece. Your emotions are your subjective piece. If our emotions start getting out of control, we're done. We don't have the capacity to understand how to control our emotions. They start controlling us, right? And then that's when you feel like anger, right? Anger and rage and sadness. And I don't know, maybe athletes, it's more anger and rage. That's what my personal piece I used to get. And a lot of times we don't understand that. And then therapists may say, oh, it's your childhood trauma. It's not your childhood trauma all the time. Is it sometimes? Sure. But my personal piece, when I would get ejected from games, mine was more so that I had a goal and nobody could get in my goal, right? Nobody could hinder my chances of winning. And I was running, right? Kind of like what I'm doing now with this company disrupting the system. It's the same way with an athlete, right? So some athletes have better control than I on saying, oh, I shouldn't back talk the ref or the ump or do different things to get you ejected, right? But more so, my piece was I was there to win, period. And I couldn't see anything outside of it. So what we're able to do is to kind of disconnect that mindset. So you have an emotion and then you have an object and they're intertwined all the time. So right now we can experience, unless we're truly in the present moment, we're experiencing an emotional piece and an objective piece or a physical piece at the same time. Ketamine disassociates those. So it categorizes them. And if it categorizes them, it makes them tangible to where we can actually look at them, which I love, right? So it allows us to step back, have some self-introspection to where we can look tangibly at the different pieces that we can actually grab onto to where we can work on them specifically. So instead of you going to a talk therapist, hey, Katie, tell me what's wrong. I feel bad. Why do you feel bad? I don't know. That's why I'm here. Well, tell me what it feels like. And you're like, I don't know. Right. So when we're struggling, we don't really have the verbal capacities to explain what's going on. And then especially as an athlete, right? They just think that we're too intense or they think I'm too intense. But I'm guessing other athletes may be in similar category. But with those pieces, what ketamine does and why it's so effective with therapy is when you say, why do I feel bad? And instead of saying, I don't know. On ketamine infusions, when your conscious is lowered and your subconscious is increased, you can actually say, oh, it's because of these reasons. And you can identify them because you can feel them. You can feel what you're thinking about at that time. And that's the amazing thing. It makes your gut feel like, yep, that's right, or nope, that's wrong, right? So all these pieces. So it's amazing. It's really, really something that shows you, one, how miraculously brilliant our brain is, how our brain's functioning the way it's intended to function at all times. But sometimes it gets on the survival track and it's surviving, and our brain doesn't understand right from wrong, good from bad. It's all in how we coach it. It's all in how we train it. So if we can't see the path and why our brain's on this wrong path, and it duplicates what it knows, then our symptoms continue to get worse. So if you come back to the trailhead, what ketamine does, it disconnects you from that negative path, and you're able to identify it, then you're able to reset it and walk down this path. So one thing I see a lot of times with athletes is we have the inability to transition sometimes. So when we have changes, our brain gets about 6 months worth of time to effectively transition. And if we don't effectively transition, we'll start getting symptoms of anxiety and depression, and they exist at the same time. So what I tell people, you got Newton's laws of physics. To every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So if there's conflict, your brain goes to polarities, which everybody's heard of bipolar, right? That's such a common diagnosis of bipolar. Well, people who have anxiety, they typically also have coexisting depression. And those are bipolars as well. Those are completely on the opposite ends of the spectrum. And we have to use one medicine for one piece and then another medicine for the other piece. But the neat thing about ketamine and having that neutrality that it causes with the meditative state, it takes the symptoms of anxiety and depression and it integrates them. And when you feel that integration, that's when you learn to live in the present moment and you get disconnected. So if you're truly in the present moment, if you're truly in a meditative state, you do not feel symptoms of anxiety or depression. You feel disconnected. And you can sit in the present state and be okay. But you're also reactive. So it's like the ninja that's sitting, legs crossed, eyes closed, and meditating, completely quiet. You throw a baseball at them, they catch it, right? They're truly in the moment. And they have these reactions because they have nothing weighing on them. They don't have trauma. They don't have depression. They don't have anxiety. They don't have any of that stuff, right? So that's an amazing thing about ketamine. So what happens sometimes when we're talking about the polarities of, this is my little chart. This is my neurologic theory that I've created. When we hit conflict, so what is conflict? Especially as an athlete, my personal opinion with conflict, it's when you change. So if you change leagues, if you go from elementary sports to middle school to high school to college to professional to retiring, it's some type of change in your support base, right? To where you have about 6 months to effectively transition. Now, a lot of athletes, when you're playing, you got hit with COVID. It's a huge change, right? Destroyed some of the kids' careers, that had scholarships or whatever else, to where they weren't able to get a lot of those. So kids who have been through that, I'm expecting they hit conflict. And if they haven't effectively processed it, then they had symptoms of anxiety and depression, which are your polarities. So when we give medications for these, the medications suppress the symptoms for an acute period of time, but the duplication that the brain causes continues. So the situation continues to get worse. So when you duplicate the anxiety and depression piece, what happens? It goes to bipolar 2, bipolar 1, schizophrenia, paranoid schizophrenia. So my personal opinion is the brain duplicates what it knows. It goes from mild to moderate to severe illness of the brain. But what we see with ketamine is it unstacks a lot of these pieces. So anxiety and depression are one thing. Bipolar 2 is more reactive anxiety and depression. Bipolar 1 is more, it's more fluctuations of peaks and troughs. But then also you get something called mania, which is where you feel like you can't sleep. So it's really, really, you can just tell to a point, it's a lot of highs and a lot of lows, and it's getting really abnormal. And then the brain almost starts going into a dreamlike state, which is the mania piece. So you have a lot of abstract thoughts to where you're considering, is this a delusion? Is it a hallucination? What is my brain doing right now? and your brain's trying to effectively cope is all it's doing. And then you go to the, right here in the middle is kind of that schizoaffective, to where it's more of the hallucinations, delusions piece. And then schizophrenia is that, to where you can't decipher, is it reality or is it not? And then your paranoid schizos are, one of the worst, to where their life is, it's really, really traumatic to them because they're paranoid, because they can't really differentiate what is reality and what is not, right? But the brain has led it into an abstract world where it felt safer at one time. And then the concentric world, which we know is 3D reality, the brain got confused with that. So with those pieces, you'll hear a lot about dopamine, serotonin, or epinephrine, all these different aspects of. My personal opinion is we don't necessarily have chemical imbalances. We more so have structures that aren't as strong as they would be. So those structures are networks in our brain, and those networks are called the salience network, your central executive network, and your default mode network. So if you went through a situation in sports to where you just can't get this thought off your mind, that's rumination. Rumination is a recurring thought over and over that you just can't drop. If you tell your teammates to drop it and they can't, sometimes they literally can't. It's not that they're being stubborn. Sometimes they're stubborn, I guess, and want to win the argument. But literally sometimes people can't drop those. So when people learn to break ruminations, that's actually strengthening the salience network. Your central executive network is the network that pulls in data, and it interprets data, and sometimes it misinterprets data, and sometimes it stores it incorrectly. So this is a big network to where we can actually, if we can have enough emotional intelligence to sit back and not say, yeah, they're right, or no, they're wrong. Nobody's right or wrong. It's the interpretation of the processing that gives someone an impression of, right? So the more we can hear people and consider different aspects of care or what we're thinking about, the more we can understand, increase our emotional intelligence, try to see, is it the impression that we're giving individuals to think that that is the truth? Or is it the impression that we're giving other individuals to think that that's false, right? We don't know. But you tell someone the same statement, tell it to 20 different people, you may get a different impression from those people because they're interpreting the language, the data, differently than other people. And then you got your default mode network. Your default mode network is a positive or negative per se. Sometimes people, that are super negative all the time, that can be a negative default mode network, but also that could be catastrophic thinking, which is trauma. So if they're always thinking the worst of the worst, sometimes that's a traumatic reaction. And it's unfortunate, but if we can't step back and allow the brain to get to that neutral space, then sometimes we can't disconnect from it. And that's where ketamine and psychedelics come in. And they're so amazing because as an athlete, everyone's brain's so strong. But then we've got people who are like, oh, it must have been your childhood trauma as to why you got ejected. And you're like, I don't think so. So it's this misalignment, of the current mental health system versus the athletic brain. And if you can see, wait, I was trained this way. How did I use this in sports? Why did I do this? Why did I do that? If we're able to utilize those concepts and kind of incorporate them, then we all can get on the same page and we can actually help improve the mental health of athletes. So with traumatic brain injuries, of course, there's anatomical, there's physiological injuries and insults there, right? Ketamine is anti-inflammatory. It actually increases the blood flow to the brain. But then also, it helps with neurogenesis. So it increases the blood flow. It decreases the inflammation or the swelling of those pathways, and it allows for more of a positive duplication in the brain, which helps people to reset from that TBI. So you've got TBIs to where, yeah, there's physical injury, but there's also emotional injury because you got hit and you weren't preparing for that hit. So your subconscious was heightened, right? And sometimes it can't get over that until you have really effective measures to address. So what I've noticed a lot of times is your brain will have these 5 areas of symptoms. We won't say diagnoses because people that are diagnosed in the mental health world, they're about 78% incorrect all the time. So it's pretty bad. So when you feel like, I don't know what diagnosis I am, I've had 12. You're not that crazy. It's just, there may be something that's coexisting to where those 12 may be one primary, right? And and who knows, we don't even have those diagnostic capacities yet. Our system's not even made for that. It's just made for one. We're so unilateral in medicine, it's disgusting. But anyway, so as an athlete, my personal sense is sometimes it's anxiety. And sometimes that anxiety, if we can't address it, it turns into the polarities of anxiety and depression. But then also you'll feel there are some traumatic situations that happen. So that's triggering, that may come from the past. You put it on the present, you get triggered. So people will have symptoms of anxiety, depression, trauma, suicidality, and insomnia. So suicidality, about 70% of individuals have a suicidal thought at some time during their life. So it's actually more common than it is uncommon to have suicidal thoughts. But then also I've noticed people who have these 4 things going on, once you stop sleeping, you do have a higher risk of hurting yourself or others, because your brain doesn't have any break to process. And with the insomnia piece, with the processing, we want the brain to process at nighttime. That's when it processes the most, because we are in a neutral state. So when you have all of these symptoms, we don't have them all, but you have depression, more than likely you've got these symptoms too. And the beautiful thing about ketamine is ketamine addresses all these things and allows your brain to process at speeds that you didn't even know it could process. So it's more so like step back, admire your brain. Don't think your brain's ill. It's just on the wrong path. And then get the help that you need, because as an athlete, you've all been trained to be, you're awesome entrepreneurs, awesome teammates. You like to get goals done. Athletes that are staying at home because they can't function after their career's over, it's a huge, huge hit to society, because we're trained to be some of the best. When we're tired, we've been hit in the gut, we get up. We've been trained to get up. And when you all feel like you can't get up and you're laying in bed, or you can't get over losing your job or transitioning from one league to another, then you just need to get help. And that's what ketamine does. So it's intermittent interventions, right? That's the cool thing. You don't get on these medications to where you're on them chronically and it's changing the neurologic landscape of your mind. Ketamine is actually 6 infusions over the course of 2 to 3 weeks. So you're able to do an intense brain training program, learn about therapy, learn with the coaching, learn all these different pieces, and then learn how to integrate it so that being in the present is complete integration. So when ketamine actually disconnects a lot of this and you feel like you're neutral, you're in this meditative state, that means your barriers are lowered. When your barriers are lowered, you feel vulnerable because you don't have that enforcer attitude around you, right? So when your barriers are lowered, your subconscious comes up. It feels safe to process all this stuff. So when it gets processed, it goes from your frontal lobe. So frontal lobe, personality, short-term memory. Short-term memory has emotions connected to it, and those emotions loop and loop and loop and loop and loop, which some people will diagnose as PTSD. It's ineffective processing. It's been stuck in the frontal lobe. So ketamine allows these things to come up. You don't have to emotionally connect with them. It disconnects the objective from the physical, or the objective from the emotional, or the physical from the subjective. Disconnects those two. When it disconnects them and you have that third-party view on the analyzation of self-introspection of the situation, goes to your amygdala for processing, processes it, gets to your long-term memory. Long-term memory does not have any emotions attached to it. So you can bring the emotion should you want to, but the emotions don't lead to context. So if you're an athlete and you are being emotionally led, sadness, fear, anxiety, anger, any of those guys, then you need to get help, because we shouldn't be emotionally led. If we're emotionally led, it's stuck in our frontal lobe. It's not been processed. And then what happens over time is it stacks. So you probably used to feel like I could walk in anywhere and I could do this and I was great. And then now it's like, I can't walk in anywhere. I can't do anything right, So when you start feeling that way, that's when you should get help, right? Get help sooner rather than later, because this is not about illness. This is about wellness, and this is about saving our lives. So unfortunately, as athletes, when we start to struggle, we're already at higher risk anyway, because we're used to pushing through injuries. So when we're starting to struggle, the chance of us losing our life is much more quickly than your common folk. because we're probably at a pretty deep level when we're starting to struggle. And we just know how to intervene, right? Because we want to get out of the situation. We want to do the next play. We want to win. We want to win, right? So, so it's one of those things to where once we start thinking negatively, having thoughts of suicide, a lot of people have thoughts of suicide because they feel completely out of control. So look at the polarities, Newton laws of physics, right? If you feel completely out of control, it's going to match this with feeling completely in control. So what does that mean? The complete in controlness is suicide. It's what your brain will tell you. But I tell people all the time, suicide's actually where you lose complete control, right? Your body's dead in the ground. Your family, you're not connected to your family anymore. You have no control over anything. You just killed yourself. So the thought of being out of control versus matching that of killing yourself, of being fully in control. If you recognize that you're having a suicidal thought, and when it happens, do I feel out of control? And if you do, then you need to identify why you feel out of control. And if you can't identify why you feel out of control, then again, go get a ketamine infusion. It will help you to figure out why you feel like you're out of control, because it lowers the subconscious, lowers the conscious, increases the subconscious, and you're able to analyze that piece. And you've got all these people around you that are helping you to analyze it if you want. You don't have to if you don't want, but it helps. So the reason too, why we become addicts or addicted to substances as an athlete is because we're medicating ourselves, uppers and downers. Alcohol is typically a downer. So if we have anxiety, we'll drink, decreases our anxiety. Sex, typically an upper. That way, if we're feeling down, then we have sex. And two, it's that, right? It's that pull to when you go out on the field or the court and you feel all those people and you have all those, positive emotions that you feel that feels so good, right? When you're going into a game and such, and then you lose that, sometimes our brain will get addicted to that and it will start trying to replace it. So spending money, shopping, sex, drugs, alcohol, cocaine, uppers, downers, whatever else, is because we don't know how to live in the present moment. We have zero skill sets on how to do that. So that's where ketamine and psychedelics come into play. So the more you learn to live in the present moment, the more neutral you are in life to where you can react on either side. And that's the beauty of it. So you become more laid back, more empowered. You get to smell the flowers because you know how to live in the present. And you don't have to constantly think that you remembered the past or constantly live in the future, because that's no way to be, right? Then we can't connect with anything. So if you're an athlete, if you have traumatic brain injuries, if you're worried about the chronic encephalopathies, look at getting a ketamine infusion. Be proactive, stand up for yourself, advocate for yourself. Look at the traumatic brain injuries to see, do you have deficits, right? Are your fingers numb? Are your shoulders numb? Do you have injuries? Ketamine also helps with pain. So with the neuropathic pain. So if you have injuries that way, look at it that way too. So keep your mind open. Look at ketamine infusions, look at psychedelics. Don't always look at the long-term medications. They suppress for a while. And then you're just constantly consuming something that truly changes your neurologic landscape. And a lot of times it's really hard to come off of. Now, sometimes they do help, but this is more so to try to help educate on there's better options out there than what we know. So if you have any questions on anything, I appreciate you listening to this as an athlete. And if you have any questions, put them below. And I'm happy to answer. Should you disagree or agree or whatever else, feel free. Let's start opening up our minds to trying to find better solutions for tomorrow. Thanks, guys. Thanks for listening.